So we'll be covering quite a lot of ground in just 1 hour. We'll be looking at, first of all, what has changed with COVID-19? What sudden shifts do we see in this new context? Then later in the discussion, we'll be digging a little deeper into consumer attitudes. What changes have we seen there? And what has been the impact on grassroots food activities? And as we move towards the end of the webinar, we will look at the concept of food as commons. What happens when we start to reframe food, not so much as a commodity, but as a public good? So we'd also really like you as participants to be part of this conversation. So you can use the chat to join the discussions. You will have a chance to share questions and comments with the speakers, but also, why not with other participants? There's plenty of you here. We want to make the most of all the expertise in the room to get the conversation going. So please don't hesitate to ask your questions to our speakers and to each other, and to start conversations in the chat. We would also like to let you know that the webinar is being recorded, so that the collection of webinars will be available, so you can feel free to share them with your colleagues, and you'll be able to find them on the SAPEA website. Okay, so it remains for me to invite Anna and Aoife to join me on screen. But first, I would also like to open a poll to hear a bit about your thoughts and warm you up a little bit. So I would like to know, how much have your personal attitudes towards food changed since the outbreak of COVID-19? And you have some options on your screen. So please go ahead and vote, and we'll see the outcomes of the poll in just a moment. But Anna and Aoife, thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. We're really, really happy to have you here. Maybe I can come to you first, Anna, to hear a little bit about the main findings of the SAPEA report and how their relevance has shifted a bit under this new COVID-19 context.
Thank you, Michael, and good afternoon to everybody who's on this webinar. I hope it's going to be a rich discussion of what is a very fast-moving arena right now. So the SAPEA report was 225 pages long, so I'm only going to be able to give a snapshot really of the findings here, and I'd urge people to check the SAPEA website for the full report and a summary document. So just to pull out 3 things here, I think, to get the conversation started. 3 of the main findings included that the multifaceted role, and just recognising that multifaceted role of food in our lives. And this is what's flagged in the report. While obviously it's essential for our survival, food is far more than simply fuel for the body. It lies at the heart of everyday existence and links us to our natural and social environments in unique ways. And this may seem obvious, but it's important to say it clearly, because the global food system has tended to focus on the economic value of food as a tradable commodity. But it also has the potential to be valuable as a social connector, a catalyst for comfort, cohesion, a positive contributor to ecosystem goods and services. But there's a wide scientific consensus, though, that the food system is unsustainable, both for people and the planet. And rerouting it onto more sustainable pathways is challenging because it's a complex adaptive system. It's made up of social, economic and ecological components, of diverse actors with multiple interests holding varying degrees of power and influence. We have a growing population with a global demand for food, and particular types of food increasing in the future. But we know the limitations of the current system, and so simply extending it would be a disaster for everybody. We need a more regenerative, circular and just food system, which means that business as usual is no longer an option, and changes in practices will be needed across the system, not just from consumers or farmers, but throughout the complex value chains, processors, distributors, retailers, amongst mass and social media influencers, marketeers, advertisers, educators. So how do we make change towards a more sustainable system in such a complex adaptive process? And certainly the SAPEA report found that there was no silver bullet technology or actor, however much we might want one. A mix of different measures will be required, some already in play, such as labelling, accreditation marks. But we need to ensure that they're trusted, comparable, comprehensible. And we also need better systems of monitoring and evaluating the impacts of particular policies and practices. There are many inspirational examples where things have been done differently. But what we need is to identify exactly what makes them work. And we need leadership from government at all scales. I think the COVID pandemic has reinforced the visibility of power and informational asymmetries in the food system, and the importance really of interventions aimed at improving the position of vulnerable actors across the food system. We need to make the system more resilient, more functionally diverse, is a term I learned only yesterday, which means that we have to have different models and different activities and different actors involved in order to ensure that we are resilient into the future. And that involves more democratic and participatory processes for forming food policy. And fundamentally, we need to be more open, I think, to social innovation, just as we are to technological innovations.
Great. Yeah, I think you've set the scene really nicely there, and it'll be great to have an opportunity to dig a little deeper and unpack some of the points you've raised. But I'd like to come to Aoife as well and hear a little bit about your work with Hubbub. What did you find in your surveys, and what does that reveal about how things have shifted since COVID-19?
Sure. Thanks, Michael, and thanks to Sapia for hosting this event and putting together the report. I've found it to be a really inspiring and comprehensive tool for my own work. Although it was published just as the crisis was emerging, the recommendations have been incredibly relevant to my work and to the COVID context. So just really quickly to explain why I'm part of this conversation, I'm the head of food at Hubbub, and we run environmental campaigns that are aimed at engaging the broadest possible public audience on environmental issues. So we encourage small actions, meeting people where they are, speaking to the things that really matter to them in their daily lives, food being one of them, fashion, homes, and neighbourhoods being the others. And within my team, that means a focus on food waste with campaigns targeted at households and individuals and sustainable diets. I think similarly with Anna said a bit of a caveat that this is a really fast shifting environment at the moment, plenty happening. I think food and sustainability, even in a more typical context, is an incredibly complex theme. It would probably take a full day to really unpack what we even mean by sustainable food. So we'll do our best to have a really engaging and informative discussion over the next hour. So turning to food sustainability and COVID, at the start of April, amidst all the chaos and confusion, media reports of hoarding, panic buying, empty shelves, etc., we at Hubbub wanted to understand what people were experiencing around food and what their fears were and what the opportunities were to support them. So to get a true picture of what people were experiencing, we conducted some national polling, and this is what we found. So giving a really quick overview at the top, we just found an incredible variation in changes in people's lives. So 90% of people said that they'd in some way changed how they cooked, shopped or ate as a result of the COVID lockdown. We found that some were engaging as food citizens, as it were, like they never had before. Others were really anxious and worried about food. Almost all said that they'd seen shortages of staples, and that would have been the first time in a number of generations that that's happened in the UK and obviously elsewhere in Europe. And around half were worried about some aspect of securing food for their household. About a similar proportion said they were wasting less. Almost 60% said that they were valuing food more than usual. Many were cooking more from scratch, involving children in preparation of food and growing food for the first time or more than usual. So some of these are things that in a normal context we would have seen as a huge win, or if they'd been as a result of a sustainability or an environmental campaign, we would have thought what an achievement. But actually it's taken this crisis to bring these kind of new attitudes and practices to the fore. I suppose one of the questions is, what does it mean? What do these shifts mean? Essentially, I think it means that the food system that we're used to in the UK has really struggled to deliver, and we need to look at it again.
Great. Yeah. Thanks very much for summarizing that so nicely. It's interesting because as you were speaking, the poll results were coming in to find out how people's attitudes towards food have changed. You mentioned that 90% in your poll reported a shift in attitude, whereas here we see that 23% of our participants feel that their attitudes haven't changed at all. And I wonder if that speaks to the perhaps particular demographic that is connecting here, but also to something that you mentioned as well, Anna, the most vulnerable in our food systems. What are your thoughts there?
No, I totally agree. I mean, we have a very select portion of people, I imagine. I haven't seen the participant list, but I imagine that these are people who have access to a computer for a start in order to enjoy listening to such discussions and the wide variety of content that has gone out there since the COVID pandemic online. There's so much rich work and attention to the food system, but it's only available to those people who have access. So there's a digital divide, of course, and of course that means that those people who don't have access to maybe digital services also don't necessarily have access to fundamental infrastructures which support everyday life. So I'm not surprised that we have a slightly different response here, but I think what the survey that Aoife mentioned really shows is that there is scope for change within people's practices. And as Aoife rightly pointed out, in other contexts, we might be celebrating the fact that people can change in ways which seem to be, at least for those who are able to access food, that their attitudes towards that food has changed. Now, that doesn't address the issue of people who don't have access to food and who were already perhaps food insecure before the pandemic. And what has been clear is that while we might have all been in the same storm of the pandemic, we're in different boats. And those boats are differently able and have different capacities to be able to respond under such extreme situations.
Aoife, does that reflect how you see it with this variation between fragility and resilience?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways we've been kind of framing this is that some people have been making sourdough bread and enjoying this spare time to kind of reconnect with nature, cook more, bring children into the mix, etc. And then on the other hand, we have really stark figures about genuine food insecurity across the UK that would suggest a higher poverty rate than the official figures normally would imply. So some of our colleagues and friends at the Food Foundation, which is a UK NGO, found that about 5 million people in the UK were food insecure during the COVID lockdown. And that's up from about 2 million pre-lockdown. So absolutely, there's been an incredible divide in people's experiences across this time. And again, I think one of the key findings is that our complex, unsustainable food system has failed the most vulnerable in society. And I suppose the kind of responders and in some cases, real heroes of this story have been local community groups who've stepped in to fill that gap.
Yeah, and we'll be getting into that a little more in just a moment. I wondered if we already see a clear picture emerging, but are there areas that we also see now where new research would be needed to paint a fuller picture of how things have changed? Anna, is that something?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I think what we identified in the SAPEA report that there's a need for more research and research that speaks to each other. So one of the challenges is the diversity of different frames of reference, different methodologies, different assumptions. And this speaks to some of the issues around seeing food as primarily a tradable economic commodity versus other forms of seeing food in different ways as a human right, as a common good. So I think certainly the report identified a whole swathe of needs around additional research, fundamental research around data. We don't really know exactly where, say, food waste emerges in different places and why it emerges that way. We simply don't have fundamental data in that regard. And I know that there's been good work going on at the EU level with platforms on food loss and waste, within which grassroots organisations have also participated, Food Cloud being one of those. And they've been calling insistently for many years to have access to more data. And I think the pandemic has simply reinforced the need for more comparable, consistent data for us to be able to understand the dynamics before we start entering into interventions.
Yeah, I think Food Cloud is a nice example, and I think that's one of the case studies mentioned in the report that people can read more about it there. Yeah, great. I want to remind participants that you're very welcome to join in the conversation, and please type your questions into the chat if you have any thoughts on points that Aoife and Anna have already raised, or whether you would like to join the conversation on another topic. Please don't hesitate. And I'd like to move on to ask a little bit more about getting deeper into this shift in consumer attitudes. You mentioned the Hubbub results that highlighted these sort of two groups and a sort of polarization as well in attitudes. Can we dig a little deeper? What more do we see there in those results?
Sure. So again, speaking to the sort of two sides of the same experience or the same coin, if we dig a little deeper into, I suppose, what we might frame as the sort of positive outcomes that we discovered. So people are, and linking to a more sustainable diet, people are reducing food waste in through a number of new habits at home. So we found, and also WRAP, which will be one of the main authorities on waste in the UK, also came through with similar findings. We discovered that people are planning their meals far more than usual, cooking from scratch, as I mentioned, eating their leftovers, storing food much more carefully than they would normally, shopping when needed rather than just as a matter of routine. So eating what's at home before going to the store again, and checking what's at home before shopping. And we asked people what sort of habits they'd like to maintain after COVID, after we emerge from lockdown. And around a third said that they want to gain better cooking skills. And this actually rose to 50% for 16 to 24-year-olds, which is a really significant finding, because that's a cohort who normally would have relatively low cooking skills, but also the cohort that has some of the highest wastage in terms of food. So that's something that we really want to capitalize on and make sure that we provide the right resources, information and tools to people in that age category, that they can continue to develop their food skills and know a little more about how to prevent waste.
So 50%, it's almost shaping a generation, this
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure a similar narrative has played out elsewhere, but certainly in the UK, there's been a really strong narrative throughout this crisis around the Second World War, what a resilient generation came out of that, and how that generation tended to be more skilled around food. And there's a sort of a narrative emerging here, which obviously remains to be tested very much, but that this crisis might create a more food resilient generation. Another kind of key indicator speaking to that is that around a third of people indicated that they'd like to learn how to grow food at home for the first time, which is very positive, and preserve food, etc., etc. Unfortunately, there's kind of the other side to that experience, as I mentioned earlier. So I did mention that about 5 million people now seem to be food insecure in the UK, and about 15 million have lost household income as a result of COVID-19. And financial worries.
How can we define food insecurity in this sense?
So not being able to access fresh, healthy food and not being able to afford the full range of meals that you'd expect to put on the table for yourself and your household. So it's about the quality of the food as well as the frequency of meals. That's how our colleagues at the Food Foundation have defined it, and it's an incredibly comprehensive and thoughtful definition, which is worth a look if anybody's interested. We discovered through our own research and that of our friends at the Food Foundation that a lot of people have come to rely on food banks and charities for their home food supply over the crisis. This is the food doesn't always tend to be of a high quality. It doesn't tend to be a nutritious range of food. And obviously people are relying on there being food available at that place when they go to collect. So again, that's an incredibly unsustainable situation we found ourselves in. And there's a real gap in the UK in provision of adequate income to cover people's healthy food needs and the reality of what's being delivered at the moment. So I suppose that probably encapsulates the two sides to that research that we undertook and also that undertaken by some of our colleagues during this time.
And
please do. Michael, to follow up on that, because I think the trends are fairly similar internationally. Certainly some recent research identified more than 17 million people in the United States have become food insecure since the COVID pandemic. And I would also support the findings from Aoife that we have found in research here in Ireland that, when you plan, when you're able to plan, and perhaps the enforced slowness of life under a pandemic has meant that, this notion of slow food and being able to plan, and the planning being a key part of reducing food waste and meeting needs. And also being at home to be able to eat leftovers the next day and the next day, rather than our frantic lifestyles where we're moving from one event to the next. We don't know if we're going to be in or out. The kind of just-in-time philosophies supported by technologies and mobile phones where planning seems to go out of the window. Certainly we found that community-supported agriculture, veg box schemes, these have experienced a massive increase in demand for their services, increased interest in community garden, and this is a pattern that has rolled out in many different countries, from the UK to Ireland, the United States, Canada, and amongst other places. And I think that that's really positive. However, these spaces are often very precarious. So community gardens are often on meanwhile leases. They don't have security of land tenure. They're often supported by states on soft money, which is the first to be cut in many times of crisis. Some work that we've been doing with Share around community composting, for example, has revealed just recently some severe cuts in funding to the New York Community Composting Project, for example, which was, celebrated as a really important example of the benefits of circularizing the economy at a community level and the added benefits that you get from that, not just taking the food waste away, but allowing people to engage with that and recirculate it into community gardens and the like. So I think, there's this real tension that Aoife has kind of alluded to between, where there are good examples, they've happened almost despite the system rather than because of the system. And so to expect that to continue when the system rebuilds itself and re-strengthens and the pace picks up is going to be a challenge. And I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that they will become embedded as habitual practices. The work that we've done, which is also reflected in the SAPEA report, is that you need this combination and alignment of regulatory rules, social rules, norms, understanding, skills, capacity, and assets to be able to embed change and positive change. And so that's what we would kind of be looking for as we move into the future, into the more long term, as we live through and with the pandemic and hopefully post that, just to build the resilience in a way which allows everybody to participate in more of a food democracy, if you like. So where people are involved not just in the formulation of policy more, but also enacting that policy in the goal of a sustainable and fair food system.
Okay, so we can't take these changes for granted then, the positive changes. We have to be wary. And you've brought us along very nicely to talk about community grassroots activities. And I know, Aoife, this is something you've been working on a lot as well with Hubbub. Would you like to tell us a bit more?
Yeah, I'd love to. I think firstly, I'd like to just, kind of support Anna's comment around how we need to protect these new habits and practices before we resume sort of business as usual, if that's the direction we're going, because it's very, very easy to commit to planning your meals and eating your leftovers when you're working at home and have that little bit more time and space in your life. I think the unsustainability of our food system in the UK and across parts of Europe definitely reflects the unsustainability of how we live, if that makes sense. So the kind of frantic pace and the almost being forced to rely on convenience have both fed into each other. So it's all about, for us, it's all about supporting people to continue to live that slightly slower, sustainable existence when we return. In terms of some of our projects at community level, again, just echoing what Anna said, absolutely community groups have had to step into the void during this crisis to pick up provision that has been missed in the official sense. Our main reaction during the COVID crisis has been through our community fridge network at Hubbub. So that was established a couple of years ago with one in Swadlincote, and today we've got 95 across the UK.
What is a community fridge?
That's a good question. So I can tell you what it isn't. People often will conflate a community fridge with a food bank, but they're very different operations. A community fridge is a community space where any person can come to take surplus food home, or retailers and certain individuals can take food to be redistributed in the community. So the purpose of the fridge network is to bring people together, as Anna nicely said it earlier. It's a social connector around food. It's a space where in some cases people can come and learn to cook as well. We prioritise fresh and healthy food at the community fridges, and each fridge is absolutely different. So one might literally be a fridge in the hallway of a church or a community hall, and others are really comprehensive sort of food hubs with a sort of a fridge system a couple of days a week where people can come and take surplus, cooking classes available on another day, growing opportunities available, or growing classes available on another day. So yes, they tend to sit alongside kind of supplementary activities. But during the COVID crisis, our fridge network essentially sprung into action in a really diverse set of ways. I think 30 or so had to shutter for safety concerns, which is completely understandable, and we were glad to support them to wind down, and we'll be happy to support them to reopen again when the time is right. Some are starting to do so already. Of those that remained open, they generally shifted to some sort of an emergency response or delivery model. So right now, for example, we've got a hub of community fridges in Milton Keynes, which are using an electric van and 2 cargo bikes to redistribute surplus food packages, including lots of fresh fruit and veg, to households all across the city, where members are still shielding or for whatever reason can't get out to get some additional fresh and healthy food for home. So I think that's a really neat example of the sort of community initiatives that don't have any official backing. They're funded with small pots of money pulled together from different places, and essentially are driven by people who are in the community, know the community inside out, and really understand and are responding to the very specific needs of the community that they operate in.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to come back to Anna on this, but first I'd like to bring in a question from Brenda McNally, which is related to both to consumer attitudes and to these grassroots activities. And maybe I can put this to you, Anna. She asks, does it matter from an environmental or sustainability perspective whether people are eating with more care or slow food or with less waste due to economic reasons and poverty, as this may have a negative connotation or a stigma with people and families feeling embarrassed about this change in food consumption, and that perhaps there's also a role for education around food going forwards?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not easy to disaggregate the data from survey to identify who within that was experiencing the drive towards this slow food from an economic perspective or from a just enforced placement in place perspective. So I think, it's not that it's just people who are feeling a push from an economic perspective who have begun to appreciate food more or thinking about reducing their food waste. But I think Brenda raises an important point, because the stigma around surplus food is real. The notion that simply because it has been deemed as unwanted by one retailer or one restaurant or something means that it's no longer good food. It is something that needs to be addressed. And initiatives like the Real Junk Food Project, Pay As You Feel cafes have really done significant work trying to undo this stigma around surplus food, because surplus food is edible food. It's not waste. It may be surplus to requirements for certain agents and actors, but that doesn't mean that it is in any way problematic. I think the challenge has been that what remains to be surplus is often processed, packaged, and not necessarily the most nutritious food. But it's a term that's applied to both fresh and other forms of produce. So I think that, yes, I think that it's important to address these issues. And certainly there will be a rebound if it is only simply forced on people as a negative experience. However, the research that we've been doing has really identified how rewarding many sorts of people find engaging with food in different ways, whether it's community garden, getting your hands dirty, learning about the process of growing food, of cooking and preparing food. And this has been demonstrated and has been demonstrated far beyond before the pandemic. I mean, some groups that we were working with Scarcity, whether it's the Skip Gardening Kitchen, which is run by Global Generation in London, who've done significant work about bringing people into contact with food in many ways, which is not simply about economic necessity. And I think this economic dominance around food has been really, really problematic from the beginning in terms of this phrasing. The only value related to food is economic value. And I think we need to move away from that.
Great. And we'll be getting into this question of how we frame this narrative in just a moment. But this is maybe a nice point for me. We've talked a bit about food waste, and I'd like to hear from our participants as well. Maybe we can launch another quick poll. And actually, this is a question taken from the Hubbub survey. So we can compare the results. I'd like to ask you, so when the restrictions were introduced to stop the spread of coronavirus, do you think your household has thrown away more food, less food, the same amount? So please take a moment to reply to the poll, and I'll be curious to see what comes out of it. But again, you've made the connection for me very nicely into talking about food as commons. I wanted to ask, and maybe Aoife, I can switch to ask you now. What do we mean when we talk about food as commons?
Well, yeah, again, Michael, this is probably something that we could spend the rest of the day discussing and unpacking. But I suppose at a very top level, it refers to approaching food as a common good and a common resource rather than a commodity, as Anna has already briefly spoken to. If we think about food as a common good, are we more likely to produce and procure it responsibly is kind of a key question for me. The approach to framing food as a commodity, which is what we're used to for a number of generations now, is super problematic. In the UK, we import about 50% of our food, despite having a perfectly good topography and climate for growing our own food. It means that a huge amount of production is concentrated amongst a very small number of farmers, all of whom are essentially at the mercy of retailers in terms of pricing structures. This has driven down the price of food, so we have extremely cheap food in the UK, but still that issue of a lot of people not being able to access a nutritious diet due to factors such as low levels, or rather high housing costs, low wages, etc. So I think when we come at food with that lens of commons or food as a right, healthy food as a right, it completely reframes how we think about where we should be accessing food, who should be involved in producing it, and what's the fundamental base level at which we should be able to access it.
Mm. And we've had another question coming in from participants, and please do keep your questions coming in, they're great. So don't hesitate to submit them, choosing all participants, and that way we all see them in the chat. Stig asks, do you think the crisis will touch on more deeper structural issues connected to, for example, the workings of the market system, free trade versus more localized food systems, and industrialized versus smaller scale food systems? What's your thoughts there? Yeah, Aoife.
Yeah, I think 100%. I mean, what the crisis has laid bare is the fact that our extremely complex global system kind of ground to a halt in some cases and just didn't function. It's an amazing system in many ways, in that, you know, there are fresh tropical fruits on the shelves of my supermarket most days in absolute peak condition, ready to be eaten. It's unimaginable stuff for even 2 generations ago. But that system, A, is incredibly exploitative of the land. It's very wasteful, and it's also reliant on, you know, almost frictionless movement of goods, cheap labor at harvest time, etc. So we've seen almost overnight that the assumption that that system works perfectly challenged. So it's, I suppose, this moment has really, or this past 3 months has really forced us to look at more local systems, which generally tended to work. Now, I don't want to romanticize veg boxes and say that if we'd all switched from supermarket shops to veg boxes back in April, that they would have functioned perfectly. Some veg boxes would have been completely overwhelmed, and other local and more sustainable practices. But a blend of those systems and a more mindful process when we are importing from overseas could give us a much more sustainable food future.
Right, and this was one of the main outcomes of the Sapea report, wasn't it? To reconsider this framing of how we see food.
Yeah, that's right, and I think it is really important, goes far beyond food, and I think that is part of the problem, is that we've seen food simply as this commodity which can be isolated and traded, but of course it speaks to lots of other structures in society. So, you know, we've long been familiar with a notion of human rights and the right to food, but how is that operationalized? So, I mean, there are many things that could be done completely differently from how we do them. In terms of the early days of the pandemic, there was some discussion about universal basic income, for example, which seems to have fallen off the agenda as we're opening up again. What about universal basic food entitlements that everybody should have, or binding legal agreements to fight hunger? You know, food security floors guaranteed by states, or minimum salaries matched by food prices. Like there are lots of different things, and there's some really interesting research which is just starting in the UK in Sheffield with other universities there, which are looking to try and establish what is the contribution of local food systems to food security. It's very difficult to identify exactly what that is, and part of the problem is to do with the metrics that we use. So, it's very easy to quantify financial goods and prices. It's less easy to quantify social cohesion or social capital or weak and strong social ties, which we have found in our research really, embed within, say, food sharing in cities. Certainly, that we found that, and it's very difficult to capture that. It's very difficult to know how long the impact lasts. But certainly, we are aware that there are much more added values when you look at local systems compared to global systems. But Aoife's right to point out that it's very important not to romanticize the ability and capacity, certainly currently under the current system, of these sort of what might be called alternative food networks to deliver. We're simply not just going to be able to, at a snap of a finger, replace the system which has been built up over hundreds of years with emergent niches which are sporadically emerging in a very sort of fragmented way, I guess, depending on the entrepreneurial, innovative, committed social grassroots groups which do it and do it really, really well all around the globe. So we need to find ways of connecting that collective civic action and these alternative food networks with leadership in government and commitment, actual commitment to sort of operationalizing this, signing up to declarations about the human right to food.
Okay, so with this in mind, Aoife, how can we make this happen? What do our grassroots communities need in terms of support to be able to help with this shift while we wait for governance to implement the top-down?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that come to mind. I mean, I think one of the framing that we need around this is to look at the way we procure, produce and consume our food using a sort of a whole food systems approach. So looking across the sustainability of the whole piece, looking at the implications for how it's produced for everything and everyone in that chain, looking at the financial cost, but also the environmental cost, looking at the impact on the people and animals that are currently somewhere in our food chain. This needs to be a real priority. And the Centre for Sustainable Food, or the Centre for Food Policy here in the UK at University of London, are engaging a lot with government to encourage them to look at procurement of food in that way, which may help to reframe. In terms of that local level piece, it's a really interesting one because, as I mentioned earlier, part of the beauty of that system is that it's diverse and it tends to speak to and support local issues, local communities. A local community leader is much better equipped to say what their local community needs against an official sitting in a government department. So it's about investing in, trusting and supporting those kind of local operations that are boosting local resilience for food, but also to doing the trust piece, but also investing so that they can kind of run sustainably over a long period of time, not being overly reliant, as Anna mentioned, on funding that can be cut quite quickly. That tends to be the first funding to go when things are being tightened up. So it's around that piece of connecting people who are doing great work, making sure that they have a voice or a collective voice to speak to policymakers, finding the right sort of funding to invest in the work that they're doing, and then essentially kind of letting them have at it and not trying to apply a single template to that sort of work.
Okay, so it's a completely different paradigm, which kind of blows open a lot of our expectations about the food system and about who is involved in the food system. How do you see it, Anna, in terms of new stakeholders and actors who we didn't previously consider now gaining new prominence?
Well, I mean, it's a tricky one because, prominence doesn't necessarily mean power and influence. And I think there are enduring patterns of power and influence across the food system that still need to be addressed and which have been made more visible through the COVID pandemic. But certainly in terms of research that has identified what is necessary for resilience in a food system, it means that we need to pay much more attention to matters of gender, social justice, ethnic groups in society, particularly those who may be seen as marginalised and vulnerable. We need to be much more aware of the agency of ecosystems, and that's another intersection with a complex adaptive system that we're really not on top of in terms of climate. The WEF nexus, water, energy, food, these are interconnected and demands on them are interconnected. So where you make an intervention in a complex system, there are unpredictable outcomes of that because we simply don't know what exactly that change is going to happen, which makes change very, very difficult and prevents lots of people from engaging with it. So I think, if we're looking for actors and agents, and certainly then broadening those for the sort of unheard voices is what we need to explicitly look for. And that's not necessarily going to emerge because these are the very people that don't have access to channels of communication, who don't necessarily feel comfortable or able to articulate their positions, values and experiences, and don't have a portal to do that under the current system of how food policy is organised in many, many countries.
And I have to say, as we've been talking, the pictures in my head have been of city life, but I imagine there's also a big urban and rural divide. Aoife, is that the case?
Yes, absolutely. So we, during the COVID crisis, similarly, a lot of our focus at Hubbub has been on the experience of the more urban communities, but we've seen lots of stories coming through of the kind of unique challenges that people have been facing in rural areas. Obviously, everything from people having to self-isolate in already isolated areas, and shortages that might be playing out in cities and in urban areas being more pronounced in urban or in rural areas as people go to shop. It's taking even longer for kind of staples and supplies to trickle through. We've seen a lot of people taking initiative amongst our fridge network again of kind of taking a van on the road and doing these huge circuits to do drop-offs to individuals' households. So yes, definitely seeing, I suppose, a more pronounced experience at the rural level in some cases.
Okay, thanks very much. And yeah, as you say, there's so much to talk about here that we could really go on and on. And I would like to thank you both, and I will invite you both back in just a moment to have a final word. But first, I wanted to hear from our contributor in this conversation, who is Camille Perrin. She's a Senior Food Policy Officer at the European Consumer Organization. And I'm really curious to hear from Camille a little more about how the discussion we've been having reflects the main findings of reports that she's produced recently. Hi, Camille.
Hello, hi, good afternoon, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to participate in this discussion, which indeed very much resonates with the finding from the survey we carried out in November last year, so before COVID, across 11 EU countries. Basically, the survey we conducted aimed at getting a better understanding of consumers' attitudes towards sustainable food. And in general, what we found was that over half of consumers say that sustainability concerns have some to a lot of influence on their food habits. And what consumers say preventing them the most from eating more sustainably was, first of all, the price. Many perceive eating more sustainably as too expensive. There was also the feeling that they lack information and knowledge on what is actually sustainable. Consumers get a lot of confusing and even conflicting messages as to what food is really sustainable. Also the challenge of identifying sustainable foods in the shops because of a lack of proper labeling, and also the lack of availability of such sustainable options. The survey also showed some very encouraging trends regarding consumers' willingness to change the way they eat. Over 2/3 of those we surveyed were open to changing their eating habits for the environment, which is very positive. Many were specifically willing to waste less food at home. I think it was over 65%. We're also willing to buy more seasonal fruit and veg, also to eat more vegetable or plant-based foods. On the other hand, cutting back on meat and dairy was more of a challenge for many consumers, and also there was rather low willingness to pay more for food that is more sustainable, and it links back to the price issue. But overall, I can say that the findings of our survey very much echo the SAPIA report, because they show that the degree of change that consumers are willing to implement in their food habits is not commensurate with what needs to be done for health and the planet, clearly. So that's why we really insist that the transition to a sustainable food system cannot rely only on consumer choices. You really need to change the entire system and the food environment that shape consumer choices.
You mentioned food waste, and I see from our poll that participants on the webinar, around half feel that they have thrown away around the same amount of food as they did before the confinement, but 40% say that they're throwing away less than they were before. So yeah, again, reflecting this picture that we see from the results on food waste.
Yes, indeed. I think COVID has reinforced some of the trends that we identified in our survey. And if we want to look on the bright side of things, COVID has maybe changed our food habits for the better to some extent, and specifically on food waste. Our Belgian member, Testasha, so it's the Belgian Consumer Organization, they conducted a consumer survey on food habits during COVID. And what they found was that 34% of Belgian consumers said they had started cooking more at home during the lockdown, and were also paying more attention to food waste. Another trend that we think has been reinforced is the wish to buy more local food from short supply chain. There have been a lot of media reports also going in that direction, most likely because consumers were trying to avoid the crowded supermarkets.
Sure.
And there has also been a real surge in demand for organic food. And that, I think, can perhaps be explained with the fact that consumers were more worried about their health, so they were trying to go for food that they think is healthier for them. But also there has probably been some sort of awakening in relation to the link between nature and our daily lives, because basically, while the source of the COVID virus are still being investigated, clearly we have heard a lot of experts saying that the destruction of nature and ecosystems that is linked to human activities is very likely to bring new viruses. So most probably consumers have become more sensitive to sustainability in general, and so also linked to the food they eat.
You mentioned the consumer experience in supermarkets, which was, of course, a huge change. And we had a comment there in the chat from Joan, who says that, yeah, indeed, food shopping became less pleasant. So she was thinking about using up food rather than having to queue again, and therefore there's less waste. She also asks, how do we define sustainability in this context when we think about sustainable goods?
It's an aspect we try to investigate in our survey. We asked consumers what sustainable means to them in relation to food. So it was very much about the perception of consumers. And what came out was that most consumers, and it was the same across all the countries we surveyed, most consumers think, first of all, to environmentally friendly, to without GMOs and pesticides, and to local. The local dimension was very important. We saw a few specificities across countries. It was quite interesting that Belgian and Dutch consumers were those most often associating sustainable to fair revenue for farmers. And we think it's because when we conducted the survey, there were this big farmers demonstration in the Netherlands because farmers really struggled to make a decent living out of their work. So the awareness can be consumer awareness about what sustainable means is also very much linked to the context and the discussion in the public domain.
Absolutely. And so what recommendations can we then make for governance based on these findings? What do policymakers need to do now?
Well, it's a very difficult task for them, definitely. But clearly for us, the main learning is that you cannot rely only on consumer choice and individual responsibilities to steer the food system on the most sustainable path. You really need a whole range of action, including also regulation from across all actors in the chain. And I think we also need greater policy coherence. We've heard a lot today about a wealth of very interesting initiatives taking place on the ground, but often EU policies do not really support those initiatives, but in fact even perhaps come in the way of this interesting development on the ground. And similarly, we also think we need more policy coherence across all European policies that affect food, so including agriculture, trade, health, etc. And this is really missing now. There is too much of a silo approach, if I may say. But we have good hope that the Farm to Fork strategy that the European Commission recently published may hopefully help us work towards a more coherent, integrated food policy.
I'd like to ask you.
I could not hear you, sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, it's this is what we'll be looking at in our next SAPEA webinar, is the Farm to Fork strategy that the European Commission is working on. So I wanted to ask you, where do we go from here? What are your hopes for the coming years in terms of what things can change and what things can stay the same?
Well, we think there is really a momentum now to change the way we produce and consume food. We really hope that policymakers will seize upon the positive trends that emerge from COVID, because there are a few positive things we can get out of it. But at the same time, as Aoife mentioned earlier, it remains to be seen how much of this trend will last. As soon as we go back to our normal life, it remains to be seen what can remain out of it. So we really hope that policymakers will try and seize upon the positive to try and support it. But there is really a momentum. We see that the climate issue is very much in the mind of policymakers now. So it's really the time where to try to push for some change. Yes, definitely.
Great. Thank you so much for your input. It's really interesting to have this consumer perspective from a broader European context. Aoife, I wonder if I can bring you back in at this point and ask you the same question. What are your hopes now for the way things go from here?
Absolutely. So, as I'm sure you're all aware, the UK is in quite an unusual situation at the moment, where obviously we're responding to the COVID crisis and the climate and nature crisis. We're also in the process of leaving the EU, and I won't get political, but that's obviously an unfortunate thing. And there's a whole raft of negotiation around trade agreements happening at the moment. I hope that there is space over the next couple of months, and that we learn from COVID to influence government in such a way that we look at this enormous scope that exists to look at more localized alternative food systems and shorter supply chains, and support them to flourish with official funding and support and technical expertise. We definitely need plenty more research around this, but we also need quite urgent investment and action. We need to think about reframing alternative food systems from being sort of niche and nice to have to being absolutely crucial to our future sustainability and welfare. And the returns are enormous. If we pursue that path, we think about healthier populations, providing diverse employment opportunities, more resilient supply. We'd be less vulnerable to shocks such as COVID if we shorten our supply chains, and the government will reach its environmental targets, or at least be closer to doing so if we kind of do a bit of a pivot to a more sustainable food system for the UK. So yeah, I think we have that pause now, and the evidence is really building that that's a very sustainable future, or a more sustainable future.
Yeah, there's huge amounts of potential for positive impact. I want to ask you the same question, Anna, but first I want to bring in one last question from our participants, and maybe I will ask you this one, Anna. It's Gavin who asks, do you have any thoughts on whether the definition of food security should acknowledge the environment? Since at present, food security is individually fulfilling, but doesn't take into account environmental impacts.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think there is a problem around a kind of diversification of numbers as well. Poverty, food security, food democracy, sustainable food. You know, there's this plethora of different definitions, and I think they come from different communities. And if there's one thing that I've learned over this COVID, which is that there are many, many people working on public health, in other words, that have synergies with the work that food studies scholars are doing. And it's about having conversations across those silos, which has been mentioned previously. So I think it's really important. And yes, I think that from a public health perspective, in a conference I was in recently, they were saying exactly the same things and talking about the environment within their concept of public well-being and health. It wouldn't be necessarily what they're best known for, but they're certainly considering it in the same way that myself, for example, will be looking more at the social and political elements of it. But we're aware very much that there are health implications, but it's finding a means for those things to talk to each other. I don't think food security excludes us considering the environment. It may not in its definition, which I'm sure there are many definitions out there, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it excludes an environmental consideration. It's just that has to be combined with an environmental consideration for there to be a sustainable food system.
Okay, so keeping that balance. And what about your hopes for the coming years? Are you feeling optimistic in terms of where we go from here?
Well, I think this has been a real shock to the system. It has shown that change is possible, but also problematic, that we can't assume that changes will be embedded. There's no ratchet system here. That was entirely possible for us to go back to exactly the same system that we had before, but it has demonstration value, I think. We need comprehensive and coherent food policy, not agricultural policy, and other forms of policy. They need to come together around food at different scales, whether that's a regional or subnational national level or a city level or community level. There needs to be food policy. And we need better ways to admit different kinds of values into decision-making and the decision-making of policymakers. It can't be just a simple financial cost-benefit analysis. That's where it's got us today. We have to do something differently. And also, I think we need to be much more creative about our imaginaries of a sustainable food future, and that needs to be co-designed. We need to admit all voices to help shape a future sustainable system. And then we might agree to some other pathways in order to get there.
Thanks, and I think it's a really nice point to wrap things up on. As you say, there's a huge number of voices out there, a great number of diversity of people who are directly involved and impacted here, and yeah, this is what needs to be taken into account moving forward. Thanks very much, and thanks to all three of you for your brilliant participation in this. We've covered an incredible amount of ground in just an hour, and it's been absolutely fascinating to dig deeper into this. So thank you to all three of you for your participation. We really appreciate it. I've asked the same question in the poll to our participants as to how you're feeling, more optimistic or less optimistic since the COVID-19 pandemic about our transition to a sustainable food future. And I'm curious to hear the results. But in the meantime, as I'd like to thank all of you for your great participation as participants as well, for your brilliant questions and the conversation that you kept going. We're really keen to continue this conversation and this dialogue with you in the future webinars. Please have a look at the SAPEA website for details of the upcoming webinars. The next one is unfortunately already full, but there'll be more added in the future. And you'll also be receiving a short feedback form that we'd really appreciate it if you can quickly fill out to help us shape our future activities. But in the meantime, many thanks to all of you for participating, and we look forward to seeing you next time.